We have our next speaker, Siddarth Madhav, who's a partner in McKinsey. I got to know Siddarth a little while ago and was just fascinated by the fact that McKinsey and him are really focusing on the whole notion of the industrial transformation that's driven by the aftermarket and services businesses. And I think he has a unique point of view. It kind of harkens back to some of the conversation that Tom and John Searle led in terms of how they think about creating value. And you know, as you guys know, McKinsey is one of the leading management consultants in the world, and they have a very, very unique point of view that that can really inform all of us. So with that, Siddarth, over to you and your presentation. I think Carlos, you can stop sharing now, and we can transition to Siddarth's presentation. Siddarth, you're on.
Thank you so much, Vivek. Really appreciate it. Nice to see some folks and be on this session. Again, a privilege. I was just looking through the list. A real privilege to be invited, and I love love the idea of just kicking around the ideas based on what I'll talk about a little bit, both our practice on the aftermarket and services side, as well as our research on this topic, right? And I'll try to keep this as interactive as possible. So I deliberately brought a very short deck, and I do want to make sure we have time to have a handful of questions at least that we can chat about. So with that, let me just share my screen. Hopefully people are able to see my screen.
Yep, there you go. Perfect.
All right, very good, excellent. All right, so just a little bit of background. I think Vivek talked about it. I got to know Vivek some months ago. I am part of McKinsey's industrial service line or industrial practice. I'm based in New York, and I serve a number of smaller industrial companies on transformations, usually performance transformations. This is actually fairly consistent with McKinsey's own evolution from being insight partners. Now, what we thought of as, that we had a project, somebody asked us a handful of questions and we helped them answer them, right? To what we call impact partners, where we really partner with companies over an extended period of time in really changing the trajectory of that company's performance. And obviously, building or helping our clients build an aftermarket services business has been an integral part of that toolkit. It is, I think, as some of you spoke already, one of the ways to quite quickly turn the cash register on, right? And in many ways it pays for itself and many other things. So what I thought I would do today is, now we are McKinsey, so we'll do some research, of course, on just about any topic. So what I wanted to do was divide this up perhaps into two halves. The first half is what I call learnings from our research, and the second half is what I call learnings from our practice, right? And really what I was trying to emphasize here is the stuff around learnings from our research, I think, focuses a little bit on a couple of things. One is, to the extent that there is any difficulty at all on making the case at the highest levels for why an aftermarket services program, why an aftermarket or services transformation. I think there's some research here that might be helpful, and I'm happy to also take more questions about it. The second half is really around, okay, what have we learned as we've gone through this? I'm sure a lot of you have shared, your thoughts and experiences as well. But I wanted to at least put a few thoughts out there to get folks' creative juices flowing, right? So, on research, what does the research say? One, I don't think much surprise to anybody in this group. One of the fastest paths to shareholder value creation. I think many people think of this in terms of growth, but to the extent that you need to go talk to an executive or a board member to get either their support or their involvement in an aftermarket transformation, I think there's some good research that shows that there is a quite direct link, right, between driving an aftermarket program and actually creating value for shareholders, which is ultimately what the executive team and the board is responsible for. And specifically what we'll talk about is I'll introduce the notion of what we call quality of revenue, which is based on McKinsey's research over the last 25 years, roughly, of every industrial company out there that's publicly traded. And what you realize is that there is a recurring nature and a stickiness to revenue that comes through the aftermarket channel that shareholders like, and there's empirical evidence that they actually reward it more. I'll share a snippet of analysis on that. And then the second piece, of course, again, is every dollar of aftermarket or services revenue is cheaper. And you've looked at this slice multiple ways, but gross margins are higher, acquisition costs are lower, and done right, churn is lower. So you put those three things in, you get much, much higher contribution margin. In our practice, we've actually seen companies that are able to drive 4 times higher contribution margin for every dollar of aftermarket revenue than on equipment revenue, right? And then as you start to transition from the research to real life, it is also something where time to money is relatively quick, and it can act as a beachhead for a broader digital transformation. And I can't emphasize this enough. Vivek and I have talked about this a lot. It isn't just about paying the bills for the other things that are going to cost more money and take more time. It is also about building the habits and the disciplines that become invaluable in what I'll call a broader digital transformation. I'll come back to the page on how, but let me just maybe dive in to the left side of this page, and then I'll come back to the right-hand side of this page when I talk about lessons learned in terms of how this has worked. So only one McKinsey chart with analysis that'll be hard to explain, I promise you. The chart on the left-hand side basically has about 300 companies. This was based on research of about 1,000 industrial companies. We took out companies where we didn't have enough data, and then we took out outliers and all of that stuff, right? What this basically looks at, the y-axis, the position on the y-axis is really how much excess multiple, and my favorite metric is EV over EBITDA for industrial companies. It doesn't really matter what metric you use, the following insight is true. What was the excess multiple that a company got versus its peer group? And just for context, we are actually very granular in terms of defining the peer group. It's typically, we've taken these 900 odd companies and divided them into 90, what we call micro verticals. So on average, you're really comparing yourself to 10 peers who are really quite similar. And this is research that is born out of many, many CEOs asking us, hey, why is my multiple so much worse than this other company that looks, feels like me in every possible way, probably growing like I am. So the x-axis is a metric which we've developed. It's called quality of revenue. And it's a composite of a bunch of things that we can measure and a couple of things that are more qualitative. But really, it's a question of, listen, are you exposed to end markets that are growing fast and growing well? What is the extent of customer concentration do you have? Meaning if you lost a customer, how much risk is there to your revenue? As well as how central are you to your customer? The first is obviously possible to measure analytically. The second is a bit more qualitative. The third is how uniquely differentiated is the offering that you have, typically measured only on the original equipment side, right? And the proxies we often use are the amount of IP they have, or indeed gross margins. And then the fourth, which is what is the nature of your monetization model? And there's three sub dimensions within this. One is how sticky are your revenues. 2, what portion of your revenues are subscription. And then 3, how much is recurring versus non-recurring, which is really, in some cases, it's harder to figure out if it's subscription or it's non-recurring. Now, these 4 things go a long way towards explaining why a certain company, in spite of growth and profitability, may or may not be getting the multiple that it believes it deserves. Now, what's interesting, and I think is a connection to this conversation that we're having, if you look at this, the first 3 dimensions that I have on the right-hand side are really hard and take 3 to 5 years to fix or change, right? You can do some M&A, but even then, to pivoting to what may be faster growing markets and convincing, the street that you didn't pay too much money and that you are central to your customers, that's a 3 to 5 year cycle. Same with, if you're trying to diversify your revenue base, your customer base, or you're trying to become more central to your customer supply chain, that's something that takes time. I would argue that within the monetization model, there's 2 things that you can do. One is you can go to much more as a service type revenue models. Again, that's hard to do. You have to overcome internal culture as well as get your customers learning a new way of paying for stuff, or you can do aftermarket and services, and you can really grow that. And I found that that is the fastest thing you can do. It's actually something you can get stood up and at approaching something like scale in less than a year. So this is, I mean, I'm sure nobody here needs to be convinced why aftermarket services and services growth is important, but hopefully it's a useful way of thinking about this in conversations with other stakeholders. You know, if you're vying for the attention or scarce dollars, right, of an executive team, right? The second point on this is an easy one, is if you look at the left-hand chart, this is the EBIT margin that 3 of my clients were able to generate from their aftermarket and services business versus the original sort of equipment business. This is a classic, you know, for want of a better word, it ends up, they didn't intend it this way, but all of these ended up being razor blade models, and aftermarket and services are both central to that story. What's equally interesting, I think, is within this, each of these segments, these micro verticals that I described to you earlier, there is a wide spread in what portion of their entitlement these companies on the aftermarket side were actually capturing. You know, the worst guys in the group in building technology, for example, are 20, and the top quartile is about 40. Electrical equipment, again, this is a little bit of a more of a hybrid category, but again, this giant spread. So 2 points, right? Lots of incremental dollars to be had. And that's the message of the right-hand chart, which basically shows the spread between low and high performers, and lots of value from closing that gap, because the margins are essentially 4 times as high, 3 to 4 times as high as the base business, right? And I like to use this chart, by the way, guys, in actually showing to folks that this is not a theoretical opportunity. There's companies that have been there, that have done that. The other guys with the gray bar, right? No pun intended, on the right-hand side of this chart, right? So 2 thoughts, right? Again, shortest, in my way, shortest and fastest way to drive shareholder value creation, partly because the shareholders really care about aftermarket revenue that has these characteristics, and B, you know, pound for pound, dollar for dollar, I would argue that aftermarket services is the best kind of revenue. It's the most profitable revenue you can have if you're an industrial company, right? So that's on, you know, learnings from the research. Sorry. What about maybe some thoughts on what we've learned as we've gone through this? I put these in 4 buckets, and I have a few more pages that I'll hit. But one, I think, and Vivek is probably the prime evangelist for this, set high ambitions. I think it's important to have a shared view of what the full entitlement is, even if that does not translate into, you know, immediate or fast you know, capture of that full entitlement. Having that as your North Star, incredibly important. 2, I think, is, and maybe 2 and 3, I should really, you know, bucket into one. I personally tell my clients, I don't care what org model. The first question I get is, do I need to set up a, you know, a services organization, an aftermarket services organization? I don't care. The thing I tell my clients is, 1, I need to make sure that executive attention is available and really engaged. That's 1, because there's a lot of simple obstacles that it really takes an executive team rowing in the same direction to clear. And 2nd, as with anything else, I would say the basics are what matter: getting the accountability right, getting the incentives in place, and building capability. And then I'll make what might be a slightly controversial point. The question around org comes up a lot in my experience here. I would say, A, not only is it the case that any org model can work, I would also say that if over a 5-year period, which really comprises 2, maybe 3 sprints in this, you're not evolving your org model as you go after this opportunity, you're probably doing something wrong. It either means you're stuck in your wrong ways, or you're stuck in your right ways. Hopefully it's the latter, not the former. But I think there is a need to evolve the organization. Right? So let me just make 2 more points, and then I'll stop talking. We talked about we talked about why we think it creates value for shareholders, and the executive team. I also think, digital transformations are hard, and aftermarket and services transformations are a good way to actually get the ball rolling, get the metabolic rate of the organization moving, and act as a catalyst to actually have some wins, right? And so, in order to make this point, what I did is I actually went to some work we as McKinsey did about 5 years ago, where we pulled together, and I don't intend to dwell too much on the left-hand side of this page, but this was, as people were starting to talk about the fourth industrial revolution, digital transformation, we went and talked to 150 executives, as McKinsey does, and we said, okay, what are the recommendations that we are gleaning across all of this? And we put these 6 things here, and I put them kind of to make fun of myself and my colleagues and McKinsey, right? We said, please create breakout structures that drive exponential innovation, whatever that means. Make sure you have a compelling data strategy. Have a vibrant ecosystem of alliances and partnerships. Cool, right? Use tech-enabled impact, right? Use IoT, use Industry 4.0. Have agile tribes. Shift the culture towards speed and making sure you can fail fast. And this would land with a thud on most executives' desks, and people's eyes would glaze over. I actually think, as I've looked at this over the last 5 years, an aftermarket transformation is actually an opportunity to actually live these 6 maxims, which honestly are just words on a page otherwise, and they're kind of very motherhood and apple pie. But each of these things has a real world instantiation when it comes to aftermarket. I made the point about starting with like a tiger team that drives aftermarket growth, then transfers accountability and ownership to an actual breakout organization, potentially. That is, for me, what we meant, but really didn't know it when we were talking about breakout structures. I think the point around building a compelling data strategy is almost self-evident. Anybody here that's worked with Vivek and his team will know that that's really what they're all about. 2 and 3. 4, Vivek and I have talked about the obvious next steps around, actually making your install base intelligent and not just a recipient of insight, right? 5, I've found that the best way to get this going is to actually have small teams that come together, cross-functional, are given a set of tools, e.g. and title, but also a broader mandate, as well as some capability and attention. And then, the expectation that you can set is you go fast, right? So I would argue that any successful or even moderately successful aftermarket transformation or aftermarket program actually has, characteristics or qualities, each of which resonate in one of these 6 things. So, I try to be quite pragmatic about things, and I think it is an opportunity to turn all of this, great research into real dollars and cents, which is sort of my final plug, if you will, for why it is important to actually get right in the culture. Right? I want to close with one page that basically says, look, there's lots of hype, lots of reality, and some reality that is at odds with that hype around aftermarket and what it takes to succeed here, right? And industrial services more broadly. Do you need a strategy reboot? I would say absolutely not. If you look at aftermarket and services, or parts and services, I've heard clients tell me that parts is not worth pursuing. They have a conundrum because they say parts are not worth pursuing because third-party guys have driven all the profitability out, but they also don't want to spend their time on services because that's a very different sort of revenue or P&L model and a very different management model. So then I go, well, what do you want to do? The truth is, there's a lot of money to be made in spares. In fact, I'd argue the bulk of money is there, so long as you're actually able to delight your customers, right? Which is having on-time delivery, availability, quality, etc. You don't actually have to compete on price. 3, I made this point around there's many org models that work, right? Doesn't have to be one. 4 is you can engage your channel. You don't have to do this all on your own. And 5, and I do think this is important, it is critically important to not just say, I'm going to give you guys fancy tools, now you guys should go and do it. this is like any other business process. You have to understand where the pain points are, where the rub points are, simplify them, and then throw technology at the problem. You need the technology, of course, to pull together the data and the underlying infrastructure and create one source of truth. But if it is anybody's idea that, hey, I'm going to have a bunch of AI that's actually going to go drive the growth itself without actually understanding how the process is broken, that's a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. And one of my clients has this, which many of you probably do. He has an acronym which goes USA: understand the process, simplify the process, then automate it. Anyway, so that's my 20 minutes. Thank you so much for listening. I'm around for another 10 minutes. I'm happy to take any questions or discussion, or should anybody disagree, happy to have that debate as well.
So that is really, really good. Incredibly pragmatic as always. We do have questions. We've got some questions coming into the Q&A tab. Amay Javeri,
Yep.
my colleague, also is going to moderate it. He has the mic now. Amay, you want to go ahead and start with the questions you've been getting?
Yep. And so the first question is from Rory Moore. And it's, would you agree that times of economic uncertainty is the right time to execute a service transformation for competitive advantage? If so, in what way can service business be used as a spearhead for a wider business transformation for any organization?
Yeah, so I think I'd say, look, the short answer is absolutely, right? Two thoughts on this. When we launch these big transformations that we do, we have what we call a portfolio of initiatives, which is another McKinsey chart where you basically say, okay, fine, every project that you're going to go do, what is the upside and what is the investment needed, as well as what is the time to complete and what is the risk associated. And aftermarket transformations, more often than not, have that best risk reward trade-off, if you will. So they're actually among the easiest to get through an approvals process. I already touched upon the fact that they also pay for themselves much faster than many others, and so they have the ability to pay for other things as well. The one challenge that I've seen, at least, and I'm sure there's other folks who've probably experienced variants of this, it takes a different kind of talent to actually drive services and aftermarket. And I think to that extent, finding the right talent is really key. And that's something that executives struggle with often, putting the right person or the right people in charge of a services transformation. So hopefully some of the research from earlier that actually talks about how this directly correlates with higher shareholder value is helpful in making that case, right? And I think maybe perhaps the last thing I will say is that it is important in this case to also engage your field, right? The field organization. Those are the guys who customers trust the most. And they often have a little bit of an allergic reaction to selling. But if you can train your field that is typically used to serve, not to sell, to actually also be revenue generators, I think you kind of hit the jackpot, right? It's the holy grail.
Thanks for that, Siddarth.
And Rory, I hope that helped.
Thanks for that, Siddarth. And so that's an interesting point that you brought up around actually training the field service team or some of the internal team to actually start going out there and selling. In your past experiences, how have you seen organizations sort of transform and evolve? Is it typically from hiring more people at the outside, or have they been able to effectively retrain internal employees, and if so, how?
So I'm going to kind of plead the fifth and give you it depends answer, but I'll give you a little bit more color here, right? I think in general, I think you're not going to be able to, or at least my clients have not been able to actually address these without an element of external, fresh blood being injected into the system. And it's for a couple of reasons. I think number one is, there's always going to be a constituency, probably not a majority, but a large vocal constituency that feels like it's not their job to sell, it's their job to serve, right? And so it takes a certain different mindset to actually say, those don't need to be in tension with each other. And second, industrial companies have typically long tenured folks, right? And it's hard to change those mindsets. So I think you need a little bit of both. Has been my experience at least. And just a case in point, yesterday I spoke to one of my clients, who's one of the largest forklift OEMs, and we had spoken to them about a year ago about a digital transformation focused on aftermarket. And he was calling me yesterday to tell me how much momentum they had, and they really saw very little momentum in the first 8 months or so pre-COVID. And I said, has this something to do with COVID, and are people basically calling in more to replace stuff? And his strong point of view was no. As it happened, he managed to hire 3 or 4 new people in a group of about 300, 3 or 4 key high impact hires. He thought that was the catalyst. So that's one data point that actually says, I think you need a bit of both.
Fantastic. And that actually makes a lot of sense with what we've seen out across some of our clients. And so the next question, I think there's a lot of data, and you've definitely shown over here that there's a huge opportunity in, the aftermarket franchise, as you've called it. Yet very few OEMs actually tend to pay attention to the aftermarket, like you mentioned. They're not interested in parts and service. Why do you think that is? And what do you think we can do as an industrial community to change that mindset?
So great question. I think, and by the way, Vivek and I were talking about this, I think, last weekend. 2 thoughts I'd put out there. I think this is like anything else. Change is hard. It takes some effort, and you need to be able to really put the dollars and cents and present a well thought through ROI and business case, right? And hopefully some of the analysis I showed at the beginning lead not with what you need, but with what you can deliver for the organization, I think is helpful. Having said that, look, you also have to be clear-eyed and realistic. Change is hard, and it's hard to get organizations to change. I think what we need to see, we've seen, I think, over the last 15 years, a significant amount of technology innovation and operational innovation when it comes to aftermarket services. What we haven't seen is a significant amount of business model innovation, because if you can't get the Leviathan, the 800-pound sort of, gorilla to learn new tricks, then somebody else could, and find ways to partner with that, with the mothership, right? I apologize, I'm mangling my metaphors. So we haven't seen a whole lot of business model innovation. The food services industry has seen some on this front, but I think it's small, and I really think that's how you unlock this to the next stage or the next phase.
Perfect. Thanks, Siddarth. And so there is one more question. I don't know if you can have the time to answer it, since we have a minute. But any examples of use cases or KPIs across your clients that you've seen that people can use to sort of begin this journey that may be easy or low-hanging fruit from what you have seen in the past?
I mean, I'm not going to answer this question, I think, directly. I mean, look, I think the thing that you guys do, where you're really maniacally focused on entitlement and what share of entitlement you're getting, I think is critically important. I think in the early going, there is something to be said for disproportionately compensating people, especially if in their perception, their day jobs are to sell equipment and not parts and services, right? Is to comp them a little bit disproportionately for getting share of the entitlement, right? Because it's a very heavy wheel, and turning the first crank is hard, but after that you get a flywheel effect. So I am, you can put sort of a wall of numbers of KPIs and metrics, but I really do think it comes down to aligning a group of people on what their entitlement should be, both in terms of dollars as well as units and ABC parts and all of that good stuff, and really holding them to account, or shining a light on how much of that entitlement they're capturing and what progress they're making week on week, month on month, quarter on quarter. And then the last thought I will say is, people cracked this code 100 years ago when it came to just selling, right? Salespeople are inherently incredibly competitive. So I would say use the transparency that some of these tools provide to unleash those animal or competitive spirits, right? In the sales force or your hidden sales force, which is your field organization. That's kind of how I would think about going about it. But I would really say entitlement, however you choose to define it, in terms of value as well as units, is the way to go. And I don't mean that to be very as a plug for you guys, right? I really do believe in that.
Well,
Perfect.
even if it is a plug for
Thanks, Siddarth.
title, we're not going to complain, Siddarth. So appreciate that. But no, thank you very much. I know you're incredibly busy. You're in between lots of meetings today. So Siddarth, thank you so much for doing that. It has been very, very powerful, and I appreciate it. So thanks.
Absolutely.
And we will follow up on some of these things you mentioned. There's a lot of questions that will keep coming in, I'm sure, and we'll surface them with you at sometime in the near future.
Perfect. Thank you all for having me. Have a good rest of the session.
Thank you, Siddarth.